I need to start this by saying that the four of us were not the type of people who scared easily. Me, my roommate Jake, our friend Sasha, and Sasha's boyfriend Marcus. All of us were in our early 20s, all college students, and we had done camping trips together a few times before. Nothing extreme, just weekend car camping at established campgrounds. This particular trip was to a campground in the National Forest about 2 hours from school. We had been there once the previous summer and it had been fine. Nice sights, decent facilities, not too crowded. We booked it for a Friday to Sunday, 3 nights. We got there Friday late afternoon and found our site without any trouble. It was a pull-through site at the end of a loop, which we liked because there was nobody on one side of us, and the other side was separated by a pretty thick stretch of trees and brush. Privacy was good. We unloaded everything, set up the 2 tents, got the fire going, and cooked dinner. It was a good first night. We stayed up until maybe 1 in the morning, drank some beers, and turned in. Saturday started normal too. We slept in, had a slow morning with coffee and food, and then drove about 20 minutes to a lake on the other side of the forest and spent most of the day swimming and sitting around. We didn't get back to the site until close to 6 in the evening. That's when the first thing happened. Jake noticed it first. Our folding table had been moved. Not significantly, just rotated slightly and pushed a foot or so from where we had set it up. We all stood there looking at it. The camp chairs around it had been rearranged too. Not dramatically, but clearly different from how we had left them. We looked at each other for a second and Marcus said probably the camp host walked through and shifted things around for some reason. That seemed unlikely to me, but nobody had a better explanation, so we just moved everything back and let it go. The cooler had also been opened. The clasp wasn't broken and nothing obvious was missing at first glance, but the ice inside had been shifted and a few things had been moved around. A package of hot dogs we had set on top of everything was now at the bottom. Jake thought maybe an animal had gotten in and knocked things around. We checked the seal, decided the clasp still worked fine, and put a heavy rock on top of the lid. That evening we were sitting around the fire when a man walked into our campsite from the direction of the loop road. Not from the road itself, but from slightly off the road, like he had come from the tree line between the road and our site. He looked like he was in his late 40s, medium height, wearing cargo pants and a faded flannel shirt. He had a headlamp around his neck that wasn't switched on. He walked in like he knew the space. That's the only way I can describe it. We all looked up at him. He stopped maybe 10 feet from the fire and said, "Hey," just that. "Hey." He looked around the site slowly. The tents, the table, the cooler, the chairs. Then he looked back at us. I remember feeling immediately that something about the whole thing was off, but I couldn't have told you specifically what it was. Jake asked him if he needed something, and he said he was just passing through, that his site was up the loop. He stood there for another few seconds still looking around, and then said nice setup and turned and walked back toward the tree line the same way he had come. None of us said anything for a moment after he left. Then Sasha said that was weird, and Marcus agreed but said he was probably just curious and a little socially off. Jake seemed less convinced but didn't push it. I kept looking toward the tree line where the man had disappeared. We had headlamps and lanterns around the site, but past the edge of the firelight, everything was just dark. About an hour later, I walked to the bathrooms down the loop. It was maybe a 5-minute walk. On my way back, I passed the other sites on the loop and looked at each of them the way you do when you're curious about other people's setups. Most of them had fires going and people sitting around. When I got to the last few sites before ours, which were at the far end of the loop, 2 of them were empty and had no gear on them at all. The third had gear but no fire and no lights. No sign of anyone at any of them. I remember thinking that if the man had said his site was up the loop, then his site should have been somewhere in that direction. But none of those sites looked occupied in any lived-in way. I didn't say anything about it when I got back. I told myself maybe he was on a different loop entirely and had just gotten turned around. We all went to bed around midnight. I was sharing a tent with Jake. I laid there awake for longer than usual. At some point, probably around 1:30 or so, I heard footsteps on the gravel road outside camp. Slow, even steps. They got close and then stopped. I stared at the tent ceiling in the dark and waited. After maybe 20 seconds, I heard the rock on top of our cooler shift. That sound was completely unmistakable. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't lift a rock off a cooler and set it down to one side. I grabbed Jake's arm and he woke up immediately. I put my finger to my lips and pointed toward the direction of the cooler. We both sat completely still. I heard the cooler latch click open. Jake unzipped the tent so fast that the sound of it ripped through the whole campsite, and he came out shouting. I was right behind him, When we got out there, the fire had burned down to almost nothing, and the area was lit mostly by the one lantern we had left on. The cooler was open. The rock was sitting on the ground beside it. The camp was empty. Marcus and Sasha woke up from the commotion. All four of us stood there in the firelight, looking at the open cooler. A package of bacon, and most of our lunch meat was gone. We swept our headlamps around the site and into the trees on both sides, but couldn't see anyone. We all agreed we were not going back to sleep. We got the fire going again and sat around it and debated whether to pack up and leave in the dark. Marcus wanted to stay. Sasha and I wanted to go. Jake didn't say much. We decided to wait until daylight and leave first thing in the morning. We kept the fire hot and the lantern on, and all four of us stayed awake. It was around 3 in the morning when Jake grabbed my arm and pointed toward the trees on the far side of the site. In the tree line, just at the edge of where our lantern light faded into dark, there was the outline of a person standing completely still between the trees. You could just barely see the shape of a person against the darkness. I know what standing between two trees in the dark looks like, and I know what a person's outline looks like, and this was the second one. Nobody moved. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Then Marcus yelled out toward the tree line asking who was there. No response. The shape didn't move. Jake picked up a thick piece of firewood from the pile, and I grabbed the bear spray that Sasha had clipped to her bag. Marcus pulled out his phone and called 911. And the whole time that shape in the tree line just stood there. The ranger on duty arrived about 25 minutes later, 2 of them in a truck. They swept the tree line with powerful flashlights and found nothing. But one of the rangers, while walking the perimeter of our site, called the other one over to look at something near the tree line on the far side. He came back and told us there were fresh boot prints in the soft ground at the base of the trees right where we had seen the figure standing. The other ranger walked further into the trees and came back after a few minutes and asked how long we had been at the site. We told him since Friday afternoon. He said there was a camp set up about 60 feet into the tree line directly adjacent to our site. Not a full camp, more like a sleeping area. A bedroll wrapped in a tarp, a small bag of food items, some of which he said matched what had been taken from various campsites on our loop over the past several weeks. He said the Park Service had been getting reports of food going missing and minor disturbances from that particular loop for at least a month. He said they believed it was a single individual who had been living in the forest adjacent to the campground loop and coming into sites at night. We packed up in the dark with the rangers present and left by 4:30 in the morning. On the drive home, none of us talked much. I kept thinking about the man who had walked into our campsite on Saturday evening, like he already knew the layout, like he had already been there, like he had been watching us set up from somewhere in those trees all afternoon, and then walked in to get a closer look. I thought about how he had specifically looked at the cooler when he came in, how he had checked the tents, how he had walked back into the exact tree line where his camp was hidden, and I thought about the way he had looked around our site with that slow, easy look that had nothing lost or confused in it. Nothing that said he didn't know exactly where he was or exactly what he was doing. We never found out who he was or whether he was ever caught. The ranger gave us a number to call for a follow-up report, but when Sasha called 2 weeks later, they said the situation had been resolved and that nobody was currently in the area. They didn't tell us what resolved meant. I think about that sometimes. Resolved. Like it just sorted itself out. None of the 4 of us have been back to that campground. We've talked about doing another trip, but every time it comes up, it kind of fizzles out. I don't think I'm the only one who still pictures that outline standing in the dark between those trees every time the topic comes up. That image does not go away easily. It's been over a year and I can still see the exact shape of it against the darkness. I've been camping solo for a long time, over 10 years at this point. I'm not reckless about it. I plan routes. I tell people where I'm going. I carry proper gear and enough food and water for longer than I intend to be out. I've had uncomfortable nights before. Storms. A bear that got too curious once. Getting mildly turned around on a trail. None of that ever made me feel genuinely unsafe. None of that came close to what happened to me in the Ozark National Forest about 18 months ago. I've told this story to maybe 3 people since it happened. My brother, my buddy who I camp with sometimes, and one other person. I don't talk about it much because talking about it puts me back there in a way I don't enjoy. I drove out on a Thursday morning. The plan was 4 nights, 5 days. I had a section of backcountry I had been wanting to explore for a couple of years. a ridge trail that dropped down into a hollow with a creek running through it, remote enough that you're unlikely to see another person, which is what I always go looking for. I parked at a small gravel pull-off, started hiking around 10 in the morning, and reached the hollow by early afternoon. It was exactly as good as I'd hoped. Flat ground near the creek, plenty of wood for fires, no signs of recent visitors. I set up camp, explored a little, ate early, and was in my sleeping bag by 9:30. First night was perfect. Slept great, woke up with the light, felt better than I had in months. Second day I hiked further into the hollow, following the creek upstream. I was out maybe 4 or 5 hours and found a beautiful spot a couple miles up where the creek widened and the light came through the canopy at an angle that made the whole thing look unreal. I sat there for a long time just eating lunch and doing nothing. Turned around late afternoon and got back to camp with plenty of daylight left. That's when I found the first thing. My camp stool, which I had left folded near the fire ring, was open, set up facing the tent. I stared at it for a few seconds. Wind doesn't unfold a camp stool. An animal doesn't unfold a camp stool. I walked around my entire campsite slowly and checked everything. My tent was zipped the way I had left it. My food bag was still hanging from the bear line I had put up in a tree about 40 feet from camp. Nothing else looked disturbed. I told myself maybe I had opened the stool and forgotten, which I knew wasn't true, but I needed a working explanation while I kept looking around. I didn't find anything else that day. I kept the fire going later than usual that night and sat up scanning the tree line with my headlamp from time to time. Eventually I told myself I was overreacting and went to sleep, but I didn't sleep the way I had the first night. I woke up a few times, and each time I woke up I laid there and listened before letting myself fall back under. Third day I decided to go in a different direction, up the slope of the ridge rather than following the creek. It was harder going, but the view from the top was worth it. I spent most of the morning up there and came back down in the early afternoon. When I got back to camp, I sat down to eat something and noticed that the ashes in my fire ring had been disturbed. I had let the fire go out the night before and the ash was just sitting there cold and gray, and something had been pushed through it, not wind. It looked like something or someone had dragged a stick or a finger through the ash in a slow arc. Just one mark, one slow drag through the cold ash from one side to the other. I felt something change in my chest when I saw that. Not panic, not yet. Just that shift where something you have been telling yourself has a reasonable explanation stops having a reasonable explanation. I spent the next hour walking the perimeter of my camp in expanding circles looking for anything out of place. About 80 feet east of my tent I found what I found, and I genuinely wish I hadn't. Back from the creek and up a slight rise there was a dense cluster of young trees, tight together with a lot of low branches. Easy to walk right past without looking into it. I almost did walk past it, but I had my headlamp on even though it was still daylight because the canopy was heavy back there, and I swept it through the brush as I walked and the beam caught something that didn't belong. Pushed into the cluster of trees, completely hidden from the outside, was a setup. A sleeping pad rolled out on a bed of flattened leaves. A dark green tarp strung low between two of the inner branches, making a roof over it. Next to the sleeping pad was a small pile of items, an empty water bottle, a few food wrappers, a piece of folded cloth that looked like it might have been a shirt, and in front of the sleeping pad, facing outward through the only gap in the cluster of trees wide enough to see through, there was a clear direct sight line to my campsite. Not a partial view, not an angled view. You could see my tent, my fire ring, my hanging food bag, all of it, from where that sleeping pad was laid. My hands were shaking when I backed away from it. I went back to my camp, sat down, and tried to think through it as clearly as I could. Whoever had that setup had been there before I arrived. The tarp was tied well, not quickly done, with knots that take practice. The sleeping pad was the kind you only bring if you plan to stay for a while. The wrappers on the ground were from multiple different meals, not one or two. Whoever it was had been living right there in those trees watching my campsite since at least before I got there, maybe long before. They had walked into my camp while I was out hiking. They had opened my stool and set it up facing my tent. They had dragged something through my fire ash. Little things, just enough to know they could. I made the decision to leave. Right then, before it got dark, I started breaking camp as fast as I could without being frantic about it. Took the tent down, rolled it up, pulled the bear line out of the tree, packed everything into my bag in less than 20 minutes. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time. The cluster of trees was at the edge of my vision from where I was packing, and I kept watching it for movement. I didn't see any. I hoisted my pack and started moving fast toward the trail that would take me back to the ridge and down to my car. I wasn't running, but I was moving at the kind of pace that isn't far off. The trail out was about 4 miles, and I wanted to get through the lower section while there was still daylight, because once I got to the upper ridge it would be more exposed and easier to move quickly. I was maybe 30 minutes into the hike out when I heard something behind me. Not footsteps exactly, more like movement through brush slightly off the trail. I stopped and stood completely still and listened. The woods went quiet the way they do sometimes for a few seconds, and then slowly came back to sound. I waited another minute and then kept moving, faster than before. I heard it again about 10 minutes later, closer this time, and slightly to my left. I didn't stop. I pulled out my bear spray with one hand and held it at my side and kept walking. I told myself it was an animal following the trail the way deer sometimes do. I told myself a lot of things on that hike out. It was almost fully dark by the time I came off the trail onto the gravel pull-off where my truck was parked. I was breathing hard and my shirt was soaked through. I got to the truck and grabbed my keys and tried to start it. It wouldn't start. I sat there for a second completely still. Then I tried again. Nothing. The battery light came on and then went out. I grabbed my headlamp and got out and opened the hood and immediately saw it. The negative cable on the battery had been disconnected. It was sitting right there, clean off the terminal, not loose, not corroded off, disconnected. You have to physically loosen a bolt and pull the cable to get it off that terminal. That doesn't happen by itself. I reconnected it, got back in the truck, started it on the first try, and drove. I didn't stop until I was 45 minutes down the highway, and there were gas stations and fast food places lit up on both sides of the road, and other cars around me. I pulled into a gas station and sat in the parking lot under the lights for a long time before I went inside and asked to use the phone because my cell service was still weak out there. I called the ranger district and told them everything: the setup in the trees, the camp stool, the ash, the battery cable. The ranger I spoke to was quiet for most of it and asked me to repeat the part about the battery cable twice. He took my information and said they would send someone out to check the area. He told me I had made the right call by leaving when I did. I've been back to the Ozarks twice since then, but not that section. Some places you go to once and you leave something there that you can never really get back.